Thus, there is nothing in the prosecution's evidence to contradict the alternative theory proposed for this incident, which is that there was a firefight between the victims and the officers in the police station Leyte sub-provincial jail. Nor is there a need to enter into these conflicting accounts because the prosecution's own evidence exculpates Rodrigo Duterte for responsibility for this incident. Not that he admits any connection to it. After all, according to the prosecution, on 1 August 2016, Rodrigo Duterte gave Espinosa a 24-hour ultimatum to surrender. And surrender he did the following day. 4 days later, Rodrigo Duterte commended Espinosa for surrendering to Ronald de la Rosa, commenting that it was just as well that he did. So if we look at it from the point of view of Rodrigo Duterte, that is where the incident ended, despite Mr. Jeremy exhorting us to believe otherwise. What happened thereafter, as awful as it may be, had nothing to do with our client, and not one witness can say that. The prosecution's narrative in Incident 14, the raid on the house of another person who I can mention, the mayor of Ozmiz City, rests exclusively on a witness who, for reasons we cannot explain in open session, is wholly unable to provide complete or reliable testimony for reasons that can be found in D36, tab 181, lines 128 to 155, and lines 191 to 212. Contemporaneous documentary police reports reflect that this police operation proceeded pursuant to 6 judicial search warrants, something hardly consistent with a premeditated murder scheme. After all, if the intention was cold-blooded murder, why go to the bother of involving a judge? Official investigative materials also indicate that officers approached the premises, announced the execution of the warrant, and were met with gunfire that struck a patrol vehicle and injured an officer, prompting a return of fire. This directly refutes what Ms. Massiter so categorically claimed on Tuesday, namely that none of the arresting officers were ever harmed during the operations. Transcript. T5, page 44, line 24. In every case, the victim was killed, and none of the arresting officers were harmed. The exchange of fire, as reported, is supported by the fact that gunpowder residue was found on 7 individuals, including on the mayor himself, and a paraffin test turned out positive on the person of one of the victims, indicating that he had discharged a firearm, something totally negating the gun plant theory proposed by the prosecution's only witness. It is also worth stressing that 4 individuals were arrested alive following the operation, and that one of them was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment after the domestic courts rejected claims of evidence planting. That fact alone is not consistent with a theory of indiscriminate execution, but is rather consistent instead with arrest and prosecution within the boundaries of the law and not indiscriminate use of force. So to summarize, across incidents 10 to 14, count 2, we see absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any attribution to Mr. Duterte on the granular level, nor do we see any evidence of a mutually agreed course of conduct on the upper hierarchical level of government involving Mr. Duterte and his alleged so-called co-perpetrators. The record reflects police operations conducted at unit level, sometimes under judicial warrant. P1166 describes operational discretion resting with the local team leaders and characterizes planned killings as rare and locally motivated. P1066 clarifies that to neutralize that word, which has been heard so often in the last few days, neutralize referred to lawful enforcement, not killing, the prosecution's own witness. The Senate committee report refers to rogue uniformed police. To conclude, the evidence reflects decentralization, not control required under indirect co-perpetration. And for these reasons, confirmation on count 2 cannot stand. Now, I'm going to start count 3. We have until 10:30. I'm conscious of the time allotted to me. So count 3 relates to the barangay clearance operations during the presidential period. Incident 15 marks the beginning of the barangay clearance operations. Now, from this point forward, a familiar pattern emerges in the prosecution's narrative. The same modus operandi, to employ Mr. Jeremy's language. Routine buy-bust operations are recast as sham exercises designed to conceal extrajudicial killings allegedly ordered from some unspecified source from above. Mr. Jeremy claims a target was identified through the use of lists. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. As one witness, an intelligence officer, explains in his testimony, the use of lists is a normal standard procedure. Once validation was conducted on a person, X, a file on that person would be created as a result of intelligence operations. Then, so claim Mr. Jeremy and Ms. Croft, the target is murdered and reports are falsified and rewards are paid out. This, Ms. Croft suggested at transcript 5, page 23, lines 11 to 13, is the systemicity of the pre-planned attack. But this is not the case. The defense can point to contemporaneous official records generated across different units or organizations that show clearly that in the majority of these incidents, the evidence reflects legitimate law enforcement operations involving spontaneous and reported exchanges of fire and uses of force subjected to forensic and administrative review. These are not clandestine acts hidden from scrutiny, Madam President, but rather recorded operations consistent with self-defense in the course of policing. And where the evidentiary record supports competing inferences, including the inference of a lawful armed confrontation and the inference of an unlawful execution, well, and with this I will conclude, in dubio pro reo. 10:30.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. So I've understood that you would like to use the time that remains to you. And you have, you still have 20 minutes, actually. I understood that you wanted to use that time. Yes, I would, but I'm not so sure if I can conclude in 20 minutes.
C'est possible. OK. Nous essaierons, madame.
Ouais, donc vous avez la...
Judge Motek, very well. It's still you. You have the floor. Proceed.
Across incidents 15 through 49, the Chamber will repeatedly encounter contemporaneous buy-bust or warrant-based documentation, reported exchanges of fire, gunshot residue findings, ballistic testing, immediate hospital transport, internal investigations, and in some cases, prosecution and conviction of officers. Against all this evidence that you've just seen on the screen here, the prosecution offers single insider accounts of alleged stagings, uncorroborated assertions of weapons planting, and nanlabans, unsupported by any forensic evidence, often speculative, frequently contradicted by the alleged co-participants, or yet, more often, complete silence from the alleged co-participants, as they were never even questioned about the incident. And most importantly, despite Mr. Jeremy's assertions on Tuesday, wherein he claimed that the police reports were repeatedly falsified to legitimate the operations as acts of self-defense, copy-paste reports in which victims were frequently blamed for their own deaths, there is zero proof, none, that the only existing contemporaneous documentary evidence is fabricated or unreliable. No proof whatsoever of this supposed falsification in the entire case record. And on this point, let us just clarify a basic principle, that a state document with the appropriate stamps and signatures and what have you is prima facie reliable, or in other words, it carries a presumption of administrative regularity. And if the prosecution seeks to displace that document and call the entire state apparatus into question, then the burden rests on it to produce credible, objective evidence rebutting that presumption. Bare allegations or reliance on single prosecution witnesses cannot suffice to overcome this presumption of authenticity and correctness, nor should the burden shift to the defense to prove that those documents are not falsified. Now, we do not deny that in some instances the record may reveal unlawful conduct by individual officers. Mr. Jeremy referred to a press release, OTP tab 108, in which the police proclaimed that 32 people were killed in Bulacan big-time operations, and then went on to refer to this as one single operation in which 32 victims were killed by the police in Bulacan. But what Mr. Jeremy failed to tell you, Your Honours, is that one of the prosecution's own witnesses explained clearly that he investigated these deaths in an official capacity soon after the killings and found that 33 people were actually killed in different municipalities and provinces in central Luzon, but that their bodies were delivered to Bulacan. This was not, as Mr. Jeremy suggested, a single incident of mass murder, but rather an improper aggregate of a series of law enforcement operations over the course of 24 hours, executed in large geographical area, and for which we have no evidence in the case record. There's no evidence on the perpetrators, victims, motives, manner of attacks, methodology, in essence, nothing to link them to an alleged fantasy common plan. Everything is just stitched together enough to give it a veneer of organization. I now turn to incidents reflecting documented armed confrontations. And as mentioned when I first turned to this count, the documentary record, which has not been displaced by any evidence proffered by the prosecution, reflects attempted arrests, resistance, and responsive use of force. And you've just seen some of the documents up there on the screen. Let's turn briefly to Incident 17, for which the prosecution has relied on a witness who stated that the planting of evidence was an open secret in the locality and province more generally. However, another witness, working in the same locality, P1208, states otherwise, that he was never involved in illegal operations resulting in deaths, was not aware of extrajudicial killings disguised as lawful operations, and confirms that there were no standing orders to kill. The operational objective, he explains, was arrest. Lethal force only when the circumstances required it. And you can find this information in Defense tab 96. And we see this pattern again and again and again. In Incident 40, for example, P1131, who worked with the individual alleged to have shot the suspect, stated clearly that the killings occurred only in circumstances of lawful use of self-defense. That can be found at Defense tab 74, and you can see it on the screen as well. This type of testimonial evidence is also corroborated by documentary and forensic evidence. Incident 15, the prosecution again resorts to its usual pro forma narrative of stage killings or nanlabans. But what it has not done, of course, is prove this. Whereas I urge your honours to look at the screen where you can see detailed documentary evidence about how this incident came about, and I summarise: a spontaneous exchange of fire after the suspect discharged a firearm, ballistics testing of the officer's weapon, affidavits by the police officers involved, and formal review and investigation of the officer who fired his weapon. Now, I'm not going to sit here and bore you with all the evidence we have on every single one of these incidents, but what I will tell you, Your Honours, is that we have this type of forensic evidence proving attempts, arrests, armed resistance, and responsive and sometimes disciplined use of force in no less than 13 incidents. I don't know where Mr. Butoyan got the idea from that there's no forensic evidence left in the case record. And may we remind you, Your Honours, until the prosecution proves otherwise, which it has not, these state documents remain prima facie, authentic, and reliable. For incidents substantiated by a single witness narrative and unconfirmed by alleged co-participants, I refer Your Honours to no less than 9 incidents. One prosecution witness, P1160, is the sole testimonial evidence for at least 3 incidents, while another 6 incidents are premised entirely on the testimony of P3. Now, what's interesting about these incidents is that P3 alleged that he was only one of a group of 3 or 4 perpetrators, and these other perpetrators are actually also prosecution witnesses. Yet none of the other witnesses corroborated his version of events. Not one. A couple of incidents alleged by the prosecution appear on its own evidence to be unrelated to drug enforcement, and thus questionably part of the fantasy common plan or organisational policy. For this, I would refer you to incidents 31 and 41, which involved targeting of 2 individuals, again, because of non-drugs related conduct. I'm not sure whether I can mention the type of conduct without revealing the identity, so I shall refrain from doing so. The prosecution has not presented any evidence to substantiate any nexus to anti-drug operations in either of these incidents. And for this, I refer you to D36, tab 158, at page 4. On the perpetrator's own account, the trigger for the killing was a personal grievance relating to property damage. There are numerous incidents against unidentified or improperly identified victims. The victim in incident 45 is described as a minor, just as in incident 38, another incident on which Mr. Jeremy focused on Tuesday. And, by the way, on the subject of the killing of children, of course it ticks the right boxes for the prosecution insofar as it pulls the heartstrings. But apart from Kian de los Santos, the prosecution has not, despite its emphasis on children, presented to this chamber during these proceedings any evidence that even one victim, apart from Kian, in its 49 incidents was a minor. No birth certificates, no corroborative evidence, nothing. While incidents presented as involving minors are indeed grave, Article 61 requires proof, not emotion. It is for the prosecution to prove that the children were involved in these incidents, and not for the defence, once again, to prove a negative. Now, this evidentiary deficit extends even further. The Bulacan Provincial Office provided a certificate indicating that it had no record corresponding to the names of the victims, whose names have been redacted on the slide, which we will show you. Okay, well, we'll pass on. But their names have been redacted. And these are alleged police killings, yet no operational report. Indeed, no contemporaneous documentation whatsoever has been produced. So on what does the prosecution base its claim that these individuals were murdered by the police other than P3? The prosecution relies almost exclusively on the account of P3 echoed by P8. And this is rather ironic. Does the prosecutor claim that P3 is corroborated by P8 when the source of P8's information is in fact P3 himself? Bootstrapping logic, once again. The alleged direct perpetrator, P1201, stated during his interview that he had never participated in an operation involving a child. The other officer allegedly present during both incidents, P1131, was never questioned about these events by the prosecution. And that omission, we submit, is not neutral. These incidents, therefore, cannot simultaneously be characterized as manifestations of a centrally designed OTBT-based common plan, because they quite clearly fall outside of that plan. And it does not reflect what the prosecution on Tuesday described as the systematic features of a national network operation. Instead, according to P3, the motive was personal financial gain through the sale of bodies. And if P3's account is accepted, it reflects opportunistic actions for personal gain of the most macabre kind. As held in Al-Hassan, an opportunistic act committed for personal profit without more falls outside the common plan. Now, just to finish up quickly on the issue of identity, in Incident 43, even the alleged perpetrators are not identified. Without identification, the Chamber cannot assess their institutional affiliation, chain of command, or attempt to make any possible linkage to Mr. Duterte. One more thing, Your Honours. The prosecution focused for some time on Incident 23. I can mention his name, Mr. Benjamin Vizda. Mr. Jeremy displayed compelling footage of Mr. Vizda's arrest and what happened when Mr. Vizda was taken away on the motorcycle. The fact that while handcuffed, he attempted to grab the gun of one of the policemen, leading to a struggle and prompting the motorbike to fall over and the policeman to shoot Mr. Vizda twice in self-defense. And that this PNP report appears to be corroborated by another prosecution witness, whose testimony fully aligns with the substance of the police document. Mr. Jeremy claimed that the PNP reports were false, relying solely on the allegation of one witness that the scene was staged. This witness claimed that the handcuffs were removed from the victim, that the body was loaded on the tricycle a few minutes after being shot and then brought to the hospital. However, his account is contradicted by the very picture the prosecution has shown you on Tuesday. Indeed, it appears that the prosecution is submitting documentary evidence which undermines its own witness's testimony. As you can see here, handcuffs are on. The body is on the ground rather than on a tricycle. Photojournalists are also present. This contradiction was even noted by the prosecution's investigators at the time of the interview and was put to the witness. And when confronted by the investigators, what did that witness say? I don't know if a prosecution must still establish vertical linkage to Mr. Duterte. But there is no evidence that Mr. Duterte knew of Vizda, that he directed the operation, or that he approved its planning, nor has the prosecution demonstrated that the incident would not have occurred in substantially the same way absent his alleged contribution. 2 minutes left. Without proof of control over the commission of the specific crime, Article 25, 3A cannot be satisfied. And finally, with regard to count 3, the prosecution's witnesses themselves concede that there was no formal approval process. Targets were selected without validation, officers acted for personal reasons, and decisions were taken locally. All of this destroys the assertion that there was a mutually agreed common plan. I will elaborate. P1160 claims hierarchical transmission of policy within the police, while simultaneously acknowledging officers' autonomous killings for personal motives. Those propositions cannot comfortably coexist. P3 explains that certain officers acted outside any common plan and for opportunistic reasons. See Incident 38. In Incident 49, P1207 attributes instructions to local officers without evidence of communication or direction from higher authorities. And most significantly, P1207 P1207 states after a certain death, once again abiding by the redactions, Tokhang operations and killings ceased. This indicates, Madam President, Your Honours, that dependence on specific individuals, not an enduring organisational policy. A system-wide common plan cannot depend on the continued presence of a non-fungible local official. And with this, I conclude.
Judge Motok, thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. All the arguments on the merits have been heard. We will now break for 40 minutes up to 10:30. And after we return, we will continue with the closing arguments or submissions, starting with the OTP. Thank you very much.